Hola, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining CLAREC today. Let you know that following of democratizing the reflections and knowledge developed within CLAREC, our seminars are recorded and later shared on our social media. For those who haven't joined us before, let me briefly introduce our group CLAREC. CLAREC stands for the Cambridge Latin American Research in Education Collective, and its founding members are PhD students at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. CLAREC aims to constitute a space for Latin American perspectives that brings together researchers working on Latin American contexts and all those interested in learning more about it. It aims to make visible the region's knowledge production and current debates linked to education research towards the diversification and decolonization of academia. Today, CLAREC is delighted to welcome Dr. Artemio Cortez Ochoa and Dr. Israel Moreno Salto as our speakers. Let me give the floor to Professor Ricardo Sabates, who will introduce our speakers and today's presentation. The floor is yours, Ricardo.
Thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure for me to be asked by CLAREC to support this event, and it's particularly a pleasure for me to have here Artemio and Israel as colleagues who are going to share with us their knowledge of this important work that they're doing with novice teachers trained in Mexico during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Artemio Cortez Ochoa is working with us at the Real Center, and he achieved his PhD at the University of Bristol. And Dr. Israel Moreno Salto is at the moment working in la Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, and he's achieved his PhD here at the University of Cambridge. And we have here in our audience many people also hearing, including Professor Susan Robertson, who's here, who supervised Israel and also has been influential in our thinking. So thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Professor Ricardo, and everyone joining us today. We're having something that is a work in progress. So hopefully we will gain a lot of feedback from you guys and critical questions for our research to improve. Today we'll be talking about these things, how we got here, initial teacher education in Mexico, an important topic, research online results, where are we, some reflections as well towards the end, and what's next, the Q&A session as well. So how we got here, a little bit of a background for this research. And during July and August of 2020, Dr. Israel, Carolina Valadares, who is present as well today here in the audience, and myself started a project administering an online questionnaire to teach students and interviewed 4 head teachers from state teacher training colleges in the north of Mexico. Basically, what we aimed at that point was 2 things. To explore what teacher-student resources were in place to cope with distance education, that's one thing. And the second, their self-perceived effects of the pandemic on educational and emotional aspects. This is a research that has been going around because we presented this in the UFED conference in Oxford. And this mainly presented a positive picture to some extent, because 95% of the student teachers said that they had access to the internet and an electronic device to engage with their learning during the school closures in Mexico. 87% or 88% roughly said that frequently and occasionally presented problems sleeping. That's a really bad thing that we were set to explore in more depth in the following round of data collection. And 80% said that frequently or occasionally had low enthusiasm to engage with learning. As said, this is a mixed methods study that we started in Mexico and we continue to do in the presentation today. And therefore, we also approached some head teachers from teacher training colleges. And one of them told us this: we, the teacher education, were not emotionally prepared to work in lockdown conditions. In that sense, we also made remote learning for our students. So this is basically telling us teachers in teacher training college were not ready for this situation. They were not able to support the students' learning while schools were closed. This is maybe the figurative terms, but we found this in one of the interviews told us. In our institutions, about 10% of teachers knew about online platforms. We have colleagues who do not even know how to turn on a PC. And that was very, very serious because most of the learning processes were migrated to online platforms during that time, also in Mexico. And this is a story that Dr. Bell will share, so as to motivate why we carry on with this research and what the findings are looking at today in this presentation.
Thank you very much, Artemio. Good afternoon, everyone online and here in person. And continuing with what Artemio was sharing, first of all, one of the experiences that brought us to our current research was this previous research on teacher education during the pandemic. Another interesting experience was I was eating at a restaurant in the city where I live, and in the background I heard someone saying, I open quote, "My niece finished her university degree in dentistry during the pandemic and didn't do her internship, which is done in the last year. How scary to go to a dentist like that." Quote, some lady at a restaurant where I was eating. And two issues came to mind. First, the internship, the last year, is not the only phase where dentists practice, right? They do this all along their undergraduate studies. And then I brought this down to the field of education. And I thought, what about teachers who graduated during the pandemic and didn't practice? As we will see further on, the teacher education route in Mexico demands that students practice their last year in classrooms. And lastly, the other issue that influenced our current research is the existing literature, which we have classified in three large domains. First, one set of literature that describes teacher education, state of being during the pandemic, as ours, what were the resources that were available to different students and schools during this time. Second, another group of literature that provided accounts of how teacher education confronted challenges posed by COVID-19. And third, there are philosophical and theoretical discussions about change in teacher education, asking or raising questions on should we continue doing the same, or should teacher education change, or what should be happening, what have we learned from the pandemic and what we were doing before in all of these matters. And our interests were on another matter: what are the broader outcomes and long-lasting effects of remote learning in teacher education? These students that graduated during these times are going to be teaching 30 or 40 years. And so how is this interruption of their studies going to affect, if it's the case, their further work? So that's why, in combination and triangulating these three issues, we came up with our current research. And to talk about it, first we need to provide some context about teacher education in Mexico, or Escuelas Normales, that are teacher colleges. These teacher colleges offer undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in the field of education. They originated they draw from French and German models of initial teacher education. The first Escuela Normal, or normal school, was founded in 1886. Currently, we have 446 normal schools operating in the country with around 144,000 students. And they train 61.4% of teachers for basic education. Some interesting facts about teacher education and these institutions: they follow a standardized curriculum. It's the same curriculum for all 446 schools. They follow a standardized route. That means that they are trained the same way as we will see in the following slide. It's following the same logic. They offer different undergraduate degrees, for example, for preschool education or primary, but it's basically the same route for both of them. In terms of funding, there's a great deal of centralization. Funds for these schools are decided at the federal level. And teacher educators, those people training the future's teachers, they were hired and promoted until 2018. Which provides or is based on how many years a person has been teaching in that institution. Training routes, the undergraduate degrees are comprised of 8 semesters, 1 capstone, and 52 courses. 16 of those courses are related to psychopedagogical issues. 20 courses are related to preparation for teaching, meaning specific content knowledge and didactics of different content. 7 English courses are learned that allow them to learn English during their preparation. 4 electives, and finally 8 professional practices, also related to in-classroom practices. As we can see on the far left, in semester number 8, they dedicate most of their time to professional practice and the capstone. I'll lend the floor to Artemio.
Yes. Thank you, Fred. And apologies if you hear some noises outside because we have a ventilated area today here, so we have some airplanes and trucks and so apologies for that. This new follow-up research is a mixed method research project that started with a literature review. This is the first thing that we did. You presented previously in Israel, and then we moved to the survey. This is the findings that we'll be presenting today, some of them. The next step will be focus groups as well, with some a sample of participants, and finally mixing the evidence. The aim of this part of the research is to explore the learning experience and self-perceived professional development needs of new basic education teachers who completed their bachelor's degree during the pandemic. And for this, we have 3 research questions. First of all, we want to know to what extent the school closures impacted their school placement. That's the first thing. We want to have the evidence that really the school closures impacted student teachers going to schools to practice in the final year. The second thing is about their perceived competency development during that period. If they develop the competences that otherwise would be developed in practice, but now learning at home, basically. And finally, we want to know about their potential professional development needs. That's the third one. And we will do it again in the following slides. So all this is framed under the self-efficacy theory of Bandura. What he says, perceived self-efficacy refers to beliefs in one's capabilities to organize and execute the courses of action required to produce attainment. So basically, we expect or we anticipate that those are related. If I feel very efficacious in certain things, then my actions reflect that as well. It can be a debate, right? But it is basically what is framing this research theoretically. For this, we are using an online survey, as mentioned, with 3 sections. The first one is about self-efficacy concerning syllabus competencies. We basically phrase the questions as if they were the different competencies that they would be developed through the syllabus during that last year in their programs. The second section is about competencies reinforcing needs, the professional development needs that they might have once that they have graduated, and some graphics. How the data collection happened? Well, this was a proposed sample, a convenient sample. We directed invitations to these potential participants. As you may imagine, chasing graduates who are already working potentially in some places is very difficult. So these kind of participants are not easy to follow or to gather in a study. We're mostly interested in this cohort, the one that graduated on 2021, according to the calendar in the Northern Hemisphere, at least in Mexico. If you see, for example, at the end of 2020, that is one cohort that was only affected by 5 months, roughly, their studies. That's not the cohort we are talking about today. It's about this one who started learning at home from March 2020 and graduated in 2021. So basically, more than one school year at home learning, not going to schools place. These are samples of the items that we used for this study. For example, we asked about their self-perceived competencies in terms of classroom adaptation to context. That's one of the competencies that comes in the syllabus of these teacher training programs, and the response options. And like in a mirror-like fashion, we have on the other side whether they need this kind of training in terms of classroom adaptation to context. And well, if you ask me, maybe you would expect to see that if they consider themselves very efficacious in terms of classroom adaptation context, maybe they need less of it, right? Well, that is one assumption that we may have. But we were surprised by the findings, actually. We'll see in a minute. The sample allocation. We will have a massive sample. We have 78 students, but the return rate from this particular sample was 33%, which is really high, to have lots of participants willing to provide some information about their experiences. In Mexico, as in many other places, the teaching profession is a female-male profession dominated by female. Around, in terms of the population, is 3/4 female, but this sample is 94% female. The age is roughly 23 years old with this range, and we have a majority of preschool programs and as well as some participants from the primary program. Again, the research questions that I mentioned before, and today we will be presenting some descriptive statistics, frequencies and percentages. Important to mention the limitations of the study are these. As I said, participants are hard to reach, very difficult to find these people. Secondly, larger representations of those more technologically skilled because it was an online survey, right? And finally, social desirability. So they reflect in their own competencies in a way that the society would expect. And moving on to the results, in response to research question number 1, I will invite you to have a look at the x-axis. On the first group of graphs, for example, on the further left side of the screen, we see face-to-face. That is the kind of practices or placements that they continue to have face-to-face. Some schools continue to have face-to-face placements in Mexico for different reasons. We can say a little bit that in a minute. But you can see, for example, if you see at the top of this graph, in 6th semester, which was at the beginning of the pandemic and when the schools were closed, many students had this kind of experience face-to-face, but it reduced as the time went on. In 7th semester, for example, less than 20%, and 8th semester, the last bit of the programs, it reduced significantly. If we go back to the graph, again to the x-axis, to the remote group of graphs, we have that, for example, it aligns with the findings. The remote learning, the remote learning at that time in 6th semester was about 20-something%, and it increased. So student teachers effectively going away from school, the schools being closed, and therefore the need for this kind of studies. What happened with the learning during that period? These are the 2 other research questions, and just for the sake of brevity, we developed this table for you to see the results. Basically, I showed you one example of the items that we use in the kind of responses that we offer to the participants. We are clustering here in 4 groups the different questions that we ask about the curriculum, the syllabus. And we can see, for example, that teaching competencies in terms of history of education, philosophy, debates in education, and research dissemination, roughly between 72 and 91% of the participants said that they feel competent for totally competent. Surprisingly, we see on the right-hand side of the screen that between 68% and 72% say that they agree or totally agree that they need more professional development in that area. And I invite you to go down this slide, reading the different percentages. In the second example, competencies about diagnosis of the school and school community needs, collaborative projects, and so on. About 94% of them said, I'm competent or totally competent. But at the same time, we have between 68% and 72% saying, I need professional development in this area. Yes, it reduced, but to me, it didn't reduce substantially. It continues to be very high. And I will leave it here because I think, Israel, you have some points to make about this. Results.
Thank you very much, Artemio. Where are we? Some reflections. That is Artemio. Looking at the research results. As a reminder, we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that this is a work in progress. We are currently conducting more analysis to our survey results. As reflections, one of the issues that came to mind is, so our last year practice is not as important as we have believed. And I think this is a key question to teacher education in Mexico, but also in other countries that follow this route of training teachers. According to Bandura cited in Amaral and Moriel, Bandura suggests that the higher the self-efficacy, the greater the amount of effort and persistence spent in a given task. Meaning that, for example, our survey outcomes suggest that students have high self-efficacy. So that would mean that they would be persistent and show essentially higher efforts in different tasks related to their teacher activities. So what's next? As Artemio mentioned, the next step is focus groups, exploring further depth their beliefs and survey outcomes. And this research visit, that's one of the purposes, to socialize with you online and in person, suggestions about how to follow what we've discovered so far. And so we're ready for questions, comments, suggestions, so on. So, sorry, no worries.
Thank you. Thank you, Israel and Artemio. I think, Annie, do you have a question from the online participants?
No, not yet, but I told the participants that they can either share their questions on the chat, written on the chat, or raise their hand if they have a comment to make. So this will be the time to raise your hand if you want to share something for the online participants. And I don't know if you have some comments there on the room.
Maybe I could start with a reflection, and it's interesting, this contradiction between the self-perception of efficacy and the need for support. And do you think that the context has to do anything with this? Because you mentioned a context that is highly centralized and standardized. It has to do that maybe because the context is like that the perception is that regardless of their own self-efficacy perception, they still need more support from the centralized or standardized context. or if anyone wants to.
Yeah, sure. It's Artemio mentioned something that's quite interesting that has to do with social desirability bias, which amongst Mexican teachers tends to be common. For instance, we can read the OECD Studies report, where Mexican teachers grade themselves higher than teachers from, for example, Japan, Germany, and other developed countries. What is interesting for me here is that if there were still students within the schools, the social desirability would be expected, right? It would be common that they would answer what they think their schools would want them. But these are graduates. They're graduates. So in that sense, one question that came to me is this social desirability bias being reproduced amongst new teachers, and where is it coming from? And how this relates, for instance, with Bandura's claims about self-efficacy being something positive. If we weigh one thing against the other, then we would have to question how useful is this sort of data. Mr. Rock.
Yes, sorry, you have to do the question. The next time we will have a mic, another thing, but for now, sorry.
So can I just clarify? So I'm Susan Robertson, and my questions are these. Well, all of your interviewees that responded to the survey, they were in their final year.
They already graduated.
They've already graduated.
Yeah.
So all of them are actually in their more or less their final year.
Yeah.
Then in their final
They
year.
spent their final year in remote learning, and at the moment we surveyed them, they were already graduated.
So one thing that would be really interesting to explore how different or how non-different these students were would be to actually see if you can build up a profile of first year, second year, because I think this is a 4-year course, isn't it?
Yeah.
8 semesters. First year, second year, third year, and fourth year students, and see if in fact actually over the course of those 4 years, there's there's a patterning going on in relation to self-efficacy and competence, as it were. So by the time you get to your 4th year, you may well have actually already decided in your 1st year, and then later your 2nd year, and then even later your 3rd year, that you've actually built up sufficient levels of competence that it's not all resting on your final year. In other words, can you tell us something about the profiles of a 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and then a 4th year student, which actually might give you some sense of the 4 final year students who actually didn't do their capstone experience quite the way you expected it. So that's the first thing. And then can you differentiate between those students who actually did physically go into a school and those students who didn't, out of that 73 that you interviewed? In other words, they'll have they may not, but they may have slightly different experiences, and does that actually split out into being giving you slightly different kinds of results? And then my final reflection essentially is, when you presented it to us, it occurred to me that that's often what teachers say, that they're competent, but there's always space to learn. In other words, there's always space for personal development that you're actually also making. And that's less a reflection of the pandemic, but more a reflection on them as professional people. I don't know if you can go back to any of them to actually ask them explicitly, how did they think the pandemic also compromised them? Were there specific areas that they think that they might have actually developed rather differently? This is being recorded, isn't it? So you'll actually have these kind of questions. But you could actually be building out quite interesting data set if we went with second, third year students along with your fourth year students and so on, to get profiles of built self-efficacy, what something like a crisis does or not. It would have been worse if they were first year students, for example. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor, for your comments. Yeah, actually, that was, we were having a conversation. Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for your comments. Yesterday, we were having a conversation with Artemio that it would be interesting to, for example, follow those students who started their teacher education course during the pandemic. That was totally remote learning during 1.5 years and follow them throughout the 4 years and at the end, see if they feel similarly to those that finished their undergraduate studies in those conditions.
Yes, because essentially, given that they were a cohort over the 3 years going into their fourth, their social status as a cohort might well have actually set them up to manage better. Let's say if you were just starting without an in-person set of experiences as a cohort. Yeah.
Someone else here in person? Professor Salates.
I think for me, there's just questions that potentially want to take me better also into your sampling for clarification. So the first one has to do with the fact that you have 78 participants, and I was wondering whether this is from your population of how many teachers that were doing teacher training in Escuelas Normales. And I think you do mention the fact that you have that selection bias that only 78 said yes, they were the ones that are willing to participate in your study. And I think understanding more that sense of sample selection will take you to the next stage on your focus group discussion, which is what would you like to get from these participants. I imagine that is from the 78 participants that you have that you're going deeper into your focus group discussion. And I think it would be interesting and important to define what kind of questions you want to get from the participants in terms of the development of competences and their potential needs, and this observation that you have, as Susan mentioned, the cross-cohort can give you some insight on why is it that you're finding, because I was reflecting on your research question about school closures impacting on the placement, and somehow I thought, well, but that's expected. The placement will be affected. So that's kind of not a question. The placement was affected. It wasn't done in person, it was then done online, if anything, or wasn't done at all. And I think somehow your design of the 3 cohorts with the 3 different experiences tells you something more about the first research question deeper, about why is it you expect differences between these cohorts and potentially by other factors, because you do know that there are differences. So it's almost going deeper to an analytical research question rather than a research question that is just by the order to these teachers. But the second and third research question I found it really interesting about how you play with the interaction between the needs and the competencies. And it is a very difficult area because there are colleagues here who are working on issues of perceived competencies. We have our project funded in India with our colleagues in Pratham at the Asser Center, and also talking to teachers to the extent to which they perceive whether there are any learning challenges for the children that they were teaching, and most social desirability was there. The teacher will not agree that there were issues. Most teachers will say, well, no, I think these children are there. So again, it is something that potentially in methodology, how do we get along away from some of these biases when actually your participants are also removed from your interview because they are answering online. So you actually even further remove that you would otherwise. But that would be fantastic to get deeper into your thinking, especially the fact that you have the opportunity of the focus group discussion. So anyway, I think the beauty of presenting this work in progress is that the questions that you ask and the two phases that you have there, you're probably all starting to have those phases about how you solve that one, that's what you do, which is fantastic. It's a great opportunity to go deeper into this field. So just a few thoughts there.
Thank you, Ricardo. There are some questions in the online.
Yeah, we do have a comment and a question from Joao, which I think would work better if he can just unmute himself and tell it out loud, if that's possible, Joao. Otherwise, I will just read your comment out loud. Is it possible for you, Joao, to unmute yourself and tell your question out loud? You can or you can't. Okay, so I will read it out loud. So Joao says that in Brazil, just to contextualize his question, it is very common for them to question the approximation of teacher training and school reality, even in a context without a pandemic. So the question is, did you ask students about how the previous distance during their education and after the pandemic affected the way they perceive teaching work?
Could you please repeat the question, Annie?
Yes. Did you ask students about how the previous distance during their education and after the pandemic affected the way they perceive teaching work?
No, we did not on the survey, but we did contemplate for the interview, for the group interview, focus groups.
Thank you. If there are no other questions there, I can ask something that I have on my mind. So I understand that this is work in progress and that you're still doing some analysis and so, but I think right now you have some very interesting results already. So I was wondering what are the next steps, I mean, with these results, and I mean, I guess you have some idea of what the teachers share on the focus groups. So what would be the next steps? How can we make an impact of these results in the Mexican context?
Thank you, Anna, for that question. As you mentioned, there is a lot to do with the next stage, which is the focus group. But before that, with this, even though it's a small sample, we're looking at exploring also these different things or different characteristics of the participants, not to generate inferences, just to describe the data that we have. As mentioned, we collected demographics on these students. We didn't have the time in a presentation to explain all these demographics that we collected from them. One of the characteristics is whether they are employed or not. That will be important as well to screen some of our findings based on whether they were self-perceived very efficacious in their teaching or the competences, and whether they are employed or not, and the reasons for that as well. We also have gender, basically. We want to know whether there's a difference, although we have a small sample of male in this sample in particular. But these are the things that we are also reporting in the coming weeks. And we hope that many of you also engage with our research when we present more findings.
Good, thank you.
Carol.
Just occurred to me another question, because Artemio, you work also with teachers in other contexts, and so were there any specific aspects of this research that you can reflect about being contextually specific to Mexico, and any features on the way that you're either thinking about the adaptations of Bandura or the kind
kind of questions that you can shed light in terms of this is much more related to a Mexican context than it is what I have seen in other contexts.
Thank you, Ricardo. Mostly, I would say that first of all, the interest for doing something like this in Mexico is because we come from that context in particular. I was a teacher, a lecturer in a teacher training college, one of those 446 that Israel mentioned. And the particularity of this context in particular is that curriculum, which is standardized. I haven't seen that in all places, because for example, here in the UK, you can have different programs for initial teacher education in different universities. It really moved away from the normal schools, which was the old tradition. In Mexico, we have this phenomenon. And all this research happens in the context of a national reform. Once again, the reform for teacher training colleges the curriculum will be reformed. And we want to reflect on all these situations because if somehow we find in our research that not having that placement in the last year affects severely the competencies of teachers, this is something that should be addressed from the outset in the new curriculum. And I don't think there is a lot of discussion around that. Many people think that the pandemic is over and the pandemic might come back or might come in a different way, different shape, and affect the initial teacher education, placements, and so on. So we want to have some support to say, look, this is something that really affects the initial professional. We should address that from the beginning. Yeah.
Sorry, Rocio, I cannot hear you correctly. Can you maybe stand on another?
Can you now?
Yes, I think there is better. No, we cannot hear you.
Now you can?
Yes, that's better.
I don't know where the mic is actually, but I try to remain close.
There, we can hear you there perfectly. Thank you.
So my question is if you draw any distinction between teacher development needs, because I will agree with Susan that they are kind of taught to always say that they are keen to have more development, right? But maybe there are different dimensions within teacher development, especially now you mentioned at the beginning the emotional aspects and demands, for instance, of teachers during the pandemic, and also that has been like a current and an ongoing trend in terms of teacher development. So my question is did you draw any distinction in the survey in terms of what a specific development need? And if not, if you are thinking of potentially drawing a distinction in the focus group or in the future.
The subcategories?
Yeah. Thanks for that. Okay, if I understood right, the question is whether we explored the different dimensions of teacher professional development needs. We did, but always according to the syllabus into last year in the program. About, for example, socio-emotional skills, which is another really important area of teacher development. I'm not sure that the syllabus contains anything related to that. That's a really good point, actually. But this is something that we explored during the initial study, in the background study with 353 students. It became really important because in the international literature, many organizations and scholars push for looking at the well-being of teachers during this time of school closures. And that's why we focus more on that area, exploring whether they need something. There is also a book chapter that I wrote in Colima in Spanish, and I can share that with you in a follow-up email, where we mentioned that there is no any training specific for teachers to work with socio-emotional skills of students in the context. And even so, we were in the middle of a pandemic. The education authority went didn't have any concern whatsoever for including any professional development in that area. So this is a very important topic. It's unfortunately not the main focus of this part of the study, because again, we are looking at the competencies that they should have developed during the school closure, but it's super important. Maybe that will come up in the focus group, as you mentioned as well in your question.
Thank you.
Someone has another question here?
I can ask another one, but I don't want to take Susan, you may relate to this question because it's about, say, how this work turns or is problematized around debates on the importance of placement versus, say, teach first. And I guess in the UK, there's been this tension between the training with placements, or you train them as they are already in the, as they are already starting their career as teachers. And I don't know whether there's any literature that talks about this, because you seem to be putting a lot of emphasis on the placement, and the placement as enabling or further developing or further enhancing these competencies. So I wonder if it is the placement, that it is that practice base that is central, and whether you were thinking that that's how you're going to frame this work as you put the paper together.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Salas. Yeah, as I mentioned almost at the end of the presentation, that was one of the reflections. Teacher education in Mexico has historically been structured that way, to end with practice, and each semester have a course related to practices. So that was the last question that we've been reflecting upon. Is it the placement, the how do we call it, the internship, as important as we believe it historically to be, or isn't it? I know in Mexico we don't have these programs that teach first to compare it, but it is something that continue to live into. Thank you.
And I would like to complement that answer as well, because in response to Professor Ricardo. Yes, the last year in Mexico is heavily oriented to practice, right? That's why our focus on that aspect. But also, when we think about the reform, for example, and I mentioned that there is a curriculum reform for teaching in colleges in Mexico at the moment. When we think about our reform, we tend to say, okay, because everything else before this was wrong. And that might be a mistake. Actually, something could be in the right place. So if we find that, for example, students develop the competencies for virtually the whole program in the first or second year, there is something that is being doing right at that period, and that should remain. Therefore, this research is important as well, because we might think in a positive way, say, okay, there are certain aspects that students that allow students, teachers in Mexico to develop these kind of competencies at an early stage, and then focus the energy and all the time for a better cause towards the end of the program in the 4th year. But this is something, again, that I can only theorize around, because we need the evidence, and we need more time to develop this kind of theories. Mm-hmm.
I'll come up and make a reflection.
So, me back again. So when Ricardo looked at me and said, teach first, and so on, and teach first, for those of you who might not know that program, or it's very much like Teach for America. Essentially, it is all kind of practice-based. You learn all of your knowledge in a practice kind of setting. I think maybe you have 3-4 weeks at best in an institution, and then you're out into schools and practice. So one of the changes that is being proposed here in the UK around initial teacher training is to actually extend out for longer the practice-based component and to limit the amount of input, which is I think what you're, Artemio, kind of pointed to, limit the input that's coming from universities to do with their their knowledge base and so on. And one of the things that the trainees basically said to us when we were actually engaged with the trainees around trying to say to the government, we actually want more time in universities where they can actually engage with theory-related understandings of school societies, thinking about how, children just don't appear, children have social class backgrounds, they come from different kinds of settings, that kind of thing. And more or less what the trainees here in Cambridge actually say to us with our more extended time in the university, in contrast to the Teach First model, is that they feel that in the first few weeks when they actually get into schools and their training and their teaching, actually they're out in schools actually now really teaching, is that they can have a very complex lesson. For example, this is to quote a student, teaching about Holocaust, and that they would actually feel that they had the complex understandings both of the event itself and also the management pedagogical skills that would enable them to actually feel very competent about that. So the longer period of time you actually had in a thoughtful, extended university setting to deal with thinking and engaging and reading the research. So a practice-only approach actually, we actually know is to some extent what the government is pushing for here, but it's certainly not what our outstanding students actually and our outstanding programs actually say. So there's some comparative work you could possibly do, thinking about the pressure that's actually coming to cut off knowledge acquisition and critical knowledge production and professional knowledge skills that would typically come out of a university setting, and just launching you bang into a school where essentially you're just, it's kind of survival mode, essentially. So my sense is you could actually be engaging also with some of the wider literatures and then have something specifically to say around this kind of turn to practice, which to some extent is a depoliticizing kind of thing with teachers and their training and so on. And we certainly don't see the evidence here. The outstanding programs here are typically programs that have got a very firm active anchor in critical knowledge production. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Annie, I think we're ready. Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's anyone that wants to share something else, but we don't have anything on the chat right now. Oh, we actually do have, oh, Seba, we actually do have a participant that wants to ask a question here online. Should we give him the floor to speak right away? Yep. Omar, do you want to unmute yourself and share with us your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I am teacher in a faculty of psychology. Teachers have a preparation that can be considered adequate to teach online classes. The problem is that psychology is a career that in Mexico has a lot of theory and little practice. The subjects I teach are theoretical. That is why the change to a distance modality first, and then to a hybrid modality did not affect me. During the pandemic, I have seen that students have been affected in a much more serious way in practical or theoretical practical subjects. One solution that I was able to see consisted in the creativity of teachers to carry out certain types of practical activities remotely, adapting some of the content and their usual tasks to be carried out in a remote context. My question is, did you see anything similar to what I just point out in your study?
Thank you very much for the question. And you are absolutely right. Actually, there is emerging literature in Latin America that says the new placements are online. The new placements are remotely. The new placements change shape and focus and the kind of layout of the classroom and so on. And in particular, in this study, what we found was they had some limitations for engaging with the learning, as we mentioned before, with the background study. But in the findings, in particular, we didn't ask anything related to that point. It's something that perhaps we could consider in the focus group for those who had different experiences. And again, thank you for that comment, because we can ask those who had experience teaching remotely using online means, or others who use low tech, for example, like we know in Mexico teachers use WhatsApp, text messages, and so on, and that differed to some extent, and their experiences with engaging learning during that period. And there are also teachers who didn't use any of these means at all, so that they had to rely on the centrally managed radio programs or television programs and so on. So what is the experience of these teachers in terms of engaging with their professional development? Thank you for that, and I think it's something that we should explore in the next stage. Right? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're finishing. I would like to thank Artemio and Israel. It was really interesting. Thank you to Susan and Ricardo for being here. Thanks everyone that is here. Thanks to everyone that are online. Thank you, Annie.
Yeah, thank you to our online attendees. Thank you to the people that join us in the room. And yeah, we look forward to next CLAREC events. Let me see if I have something else to say about besides thanking you. So just don't forget to follow CLAREC's social media to keep informed about future events. And yeah, this is all for today's seminar. So thank you very much to everyone, and we hope to see you again very soon.
With the clap.